Hi, my name is Rahnuma Nishat. I'm from the Department of Computer Science at Ryerson University. I'm presenting the paper Reconfiguring Simple ST Hamiltonian Paths in Rectangular Grid Graphs. This is a joint work with Dr. Venkatesh Srinivasan and Dr. Sue Whitesides, both from the Department of Computer Science, University of Victoria. In this paper, we give an algorithm to reconfigure simple ST Hamiltonian paths in rectangular grid graphs. We will first define rectangular grid graphs, then we will define simple ST Hamiltonian paths, then we'll ask the reconfiguration question. Finally, we give an algorithm to do the reconfiguration. This is a rectangular grid graph. It has m rows and n columns. It has a rectangular outer boundary, which can be divided into 4 boundaries, east, west, north, and south, based on the direction. S and T are the top left and the bottom right corners, which would also be the endpoints of our Hamiltonian paths. The bottom left and the top right corners are alpha and beta. So this is an ST Hamiltonian path in the grid graph G. It starts from S, ends at T. This particular path has some special properties, which is each internal subpath has minimum possible bends. So before going into the minimum possible bends, we need to know what an internal subpath is. And here are some examples. An internal subpath is a path from one boundary vertex to another boundary vertex, and all the other vertices on that path must be internal to the grid. Here we have 3 examples. The red one connects 2 boundary vertices on the north and west boundaries, and they use just one bend, which is minimum possible. On the other hand, the purple subpath that connects north and south boundary vertices uses no bend because no bends are necessary. These boundaries are opposite. And the blue internal subpath connects 2 boundary vertices on the same boundary, and it uses 2 bends, which is minimum possible. So because each internal subpath uses the simplest structure possible, we call this path a simple ST Hamiltonian path. Now the reconfiguration question. Given 2 simple ST Hamiltonian paths P1 and P2, we ask this question: can I go from P1 to P2 using some operation where each internal step would be also an ST Hamiltonian path? And please note that we are not studying the existence of such paths. We assume that we are already given the input P1 and P2 because the existence problem has already been studied by many people. For example, Idai, Papadimitriou, and Schwartz-Feder gave necessary and sufficient conditions for the existence of a Hamiltonian path between any pair of vertices in a rectangular grid graph. Everett later studied existence of Hamiltonian paths in non-rectangular grids. Collins and Crumpard gave generating functions for ST Hamiltonian paths where one of the dimensions of the rectangular grid is less than equals 5. Rasky and Sawada studied Hamiltonian cycles in grid graphs where the cycles bend at each vertex. Reconfiguring Hamiltonian cycles in grid graphs is a relatively new topic. Takaoka has shown that for some unembedded graph classes, the reconfiguration problem is p-space complete under the switch operation. Lignus, on the other hand, has shown that under the same switch operation, the problem is linear time solvable if the maximum degree of the graph is 5. Nishat and Whitesides gave reconfiguration algorithms for class of Hamiltonian cycles in grid graphs without holes. But to the best of our knowledge, this is the first work on reconfiguration of Hamiltonian paths. So why are we studying this problem? First of all, it is a very fascinating theoretical problem like other reconfiguration problems such as reconfiguring triangulations and dominating sets, etc. But it also has practical applications, for example, in path planning, in additive manufacturing like 3D printing, in robot navigation, in chemistry, in solving traveling salesman problems, and other theoretical problems. Now, if we go back to our reconfiguration problems, we have this ST Hamiltonian path graph of G. I can visualize this in terms of this ST Hamiltonian path graph of G. Here, each vertex is an ST Hamiltonian path of G. So we can visualize this as the solution space of the Hamiltonian path problem of G. And P1 and P2 are the two paths that we have seen before. These are simple, but the other ST Hamiltonian paths, they may not be simple. And the edge of this graph would be defined by an operation that we define, and an application of that operation would reconfigure one Hamiltonian path to other. For example, suppose we define some operation, and that reconfigures P1 to this path when applied somewhere on this path. Suppose the same operation when applied elsewhere on P1 gives us a different Hamiltonian path. And in this way, we generate all the edges. And now we want to find a path from P1 to P2 in this graph. So that is our reconfiguration problem. And is it possible? Can we find a path between any two simple ST Hamiltonian paths in this graph? The answer depends on what operation we defined. And in this paper, our operation for reconfiguration is pairs of switch operations. One switch operation is shown in this figure. We apply a switch operation on an embedded cell of the grid where the path contributes exactly two edges that are parallel to each other on the cell, and the switch operation just flips the edges. So if we had horizontal vertical to start with, we get horizontal, and if we had horizontal, we're gonna get back to vertical. But why do we need a pair? Because a single switch operation actually breaks a Hamiltonian path into two components of a cycle path cover. That is a path and a cycle that covers all the grid vertices together. And that is because we used the switch operation, we defined the switch operation on an embedded cell. So we need a way to join these two components to get an ST Hamiltonian path back. And this is the way to do that. So suppose we applied the first switch operation on F that gave us a path and a cycle. And if we apply operation on F prime, where one edge is from the cycle and the other edge is from the path, it actually combines the two components and we get an ST Hamiltonian path back. But the wrong way to do it is applying switch operation on a cell where both the edges are from the same component of the cycle path cover. In that case, we're going to break it into even more components. So we need a mechanism to pair the switch operations, because any pair of switch operation will not give us ST Hamiltonian paths in the intermediate steps. And we also need to learn the structure of simple ST Hamiltonian paths so that we can find the right algorithm. So this is our P1, the simple ST Hamiltonian path that we showed at the beginning. And we showed all the internal subpaths. Now we're going to assign names to them. So the red ones, we call them corner separator because it cuts a corner. It either cuts a corner like a corner with S, or it cuts a corner T. It doesn't cut alpha or beta because these are not endpoints of the path. The purple internal subpaths, we call them straight separators because they're straight. And the remaining subpath, we call them cookies. Based on the boundary that the cookie stands on, we have 4 types of cookies. This is a west cookie. So if we look at the straight separators, we'll see that all the straight separator appear consecutively on the path, and they occupy, in this case, they're occupying adjacent columns. We're going to see in the next slide that sometimes the straight separators occupy adjacent rows. So here they're occupying adjacent columns, and if we look at this rectangular region, it contains all the straight separators. We call that rectangle mid, or R mid for short. This actually separates S from T, and the region on the west side, this is the initial subpath because the path started here. This is the final subpath. This rectangular region has S as one of its corner and is bounded by the farthest corner separator from S on the west side of the rectangle mid. We call it RS. Similarly, we can define this region RT, which is T as a corner vertex, and bounded by the corner separator that is farthest from T on the east side. In this case, there's just one corner separator, and that is bounding this region. This region is called R alpha, and this region is called R beta because it has alpha and beta as corners. And our algorithm reconfigures ST Hamiltonian paths region by region. That is why it is important to know the regions. Now, note that this path visits alpha before beta, and that's why we have vertical straight separators. And R alpha and RS on one side, R beta and RT on the other side. But if the path had visited beta before alpha, then we would have horizontal straight separators, and then RS and R beta would be on one side, and R alpha and RT would be on the other side. Without loss of generality, in the examples that we will show in the next slides, we will assume that this is our starting point. This is the starting path. So now we need a mechanism to pair switches, and we call it a zip operation. First, we need a line and with two endpoints, Q1 and Q2. This is directed from Q1 to Q2. We call it a zip line, and it is placed on a row or column. Now, a track is a pair of adjacent rows or columns, and you'll see that when a zip line is placed, it has two tracks adjacent to it or incident on it. We assign one of the tracks to be the cookie track where we're going to grow the cookie, and the other track is, we call it the side track. So walking from Q1 to Q2, we first find the first switchable cell in the cookie track. And what is a switchable cell? Of course, it has to have exactly two edges on the path that is parallel to each other. And in this case, another requirement is that the two path edges must be perpendicular to the zip line. So this is our first switchable cell. And then we keep walking and find the next switchable cell in the side track. And these two are a pair. So if we do a switch here, it's going to break the path into two components, and the next switch in the red dotted cell will join the two components together to give us another ST Hamiltonian path. And then we find the next pairs and the next pairs. And finally, we just apply switch to all of them together to grow the cookie up to this length Q2. And we now have an ST Hamiltonian path after 3 pairs of switches. So now that we know there is a mechanism zip to pair switches, we can go to the algorithm. So if we want to go from P1 to P2, we actually take this route. We go from P1 to a simpler, a simple ST Hamiltonian path with somewhat simpler structure. Similarly, we go from P2 to a similar path. We call them a canonical ST Hamiltonian paths because they have only straight separators and no corner separators or no cookies. Now, if P3 and P4 are not the same paths, we have to reconfigure P3 to P4. And then we just reverse the steps that we took from P2 to P4 to get a complete path from P1 to P2. Now, we're going to discuss an algorithm that would take any simple ST Hamiltonian path and convert it to one of these forms, and then another algorithm that takes one canonical path and converts it to another. So first, we start from P1 and we want to go to a canonical path. And when we discussed the regions, we said that our algorithm reconfigures the path region by region. So the first region we're going to reconfigure is this yellow region, RS. So we start with a zip line here, one endpoint on the west boundary and other endpoint on the last corner separator that is farthest from S on the west side of our mid. And we're going to apply a zip, then sweep the zip line down 2 rows, and then find all the switchable cells and apply another zip. And then again, finally, we have a region that contains only west cookies. Please note that because we started with an even number of corner separators, we used the horizontal zip line and swept down. But if we had an odd number of corner separators, we would start with a vertical sweep line here on column 1, and we would sweep to the right. So after reconfiguring this region, we reconfigure RS and R alpha together, the whole region to the left of our mid. And this time we start with a vertical sweep line, do a zip that grows a south cookie up to the maximum height up to the north boundary, converting the south cookie to a pair of straight separators. Then we sweep, so this was where the zip line was, and then we sweep 2 columns to the left and apply the second zip operation. Then we sweep to the left again, apply zip operation, and in this way we now have only straight separators covering this region, which used to be RS and R alpha. Now we do the same thing in RT, but note that here we have an odd number of separator. Actually, this is just one single corner separator. So even if we do a sweep here using vertical zip lines, it is not going to change anything. It will just remain the same. And then we reconfigure these 2 regions, R beta and RT together using a vertical sweep line and sweep to the right until we reach the east boundary. And finally, we get this form, which is a canonical path already. This is just an example where we started with even number of corner separator cutting off S and a single corner separator cutting off T, but we can have other scenarios where at this point we are going to end up with something like this. So we may have west cookies and east cookies both, or just west cookies or just east cookies, and that in this case we have to do one more sweep down starting from row 1, and we have to sweep all the way from the west. The zip line should extend all the way from the west to east boundary, and then we do the zip and sweep 2 rows down and do the zip again, and in this way we are going to get finally to the canonical path that we aimed for. Now the second part of our algorithm, going from one canonical to another canonical, that actually works in a very similar way to this sweep process here. So we start with a zip line in row 1 that extends from the west to east boundary, and we do the zip. We sweep 2 rows down, do another zip, so 2 rows down, do another zip, and finally we're gonna get to this path. So to summarize our contribution, we started the study of reconfiguration of ST Hamiltonian paths. We defined simple ST Hamiltonian paths and established a structure of such paths. We also defined the zip operation, which is a mechanism to pair switch operations on embedded Hamiltonian paths in grid graph, so that when reconfiguring, we get ST Hamiltonian paths in the intermediate steps. Finally, we gave an algorithm to reconfigure between any 2 simple ST Hamiltonian paths using zips in an M by N grid graph. And we used order of Mn pairs of switch operations. We finish up with some open problems. We showed that when we reconfigured a simple ST Hamiltonian path to another simple ST Hamiltonian path, the intermediate paths were not simple. So that would be our next step. Can we find an algorithm that where all the intermediate steps are also ST Hamiltonian paths? All the separators in our simple path had at most 1 bend. Can we find a reconfiguration algorithm where separators have more than 1 bend? For example, in this case, separators have 2 bends too, the green separators. Can we find a classification for them? Can we reconfigure such paths? More generally, we can consider grids with arbitrary outer boundary, Hamiltonian paths with arbitrary pair of endpoints, not just diagonally opposite corner points. We can consider other grids such as triangular grids, hexagonal grids, etc. And we can also consider higher dimensions. So with all these open problems, I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you very much for your time. Hope to see you at the conference.